This is Hidden Roll, the podcast where we introduce you to the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. Before today's episode with Connie Vogelmann, we need to talk about some changes coming to the podcast. I'm going to drop the radio voice for a moment. We need your help. We make this podcast at our cost because we love sharing the stories behind the industry of play and its incredible community. But in order to offset the time and expense of editing and publishing these episodes, we really need to start growing our audience. We have a plan. We want to reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube by the end of summer. And to do that, we need your help. If you are listening to this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform and you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so that you can be notified every time we post a new episode. We've got great new content that we're going to be posting every Wednesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, Hidden Roll Podcast, thumbs up our videos, leave a comment or two, and tell your friends and family to subscribe so that we can continue sharing stories about the brains behind all things play. With that out of the way, we'd also like to give special thanks to our old friends at POP, peopleofplay.com, the one-stop hub for all toy and game inventors. Without them, this podcast would not be possible.
You're listening to Hidden Roll, the podcast that introduces you to the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. I'm artist, engineer, and game inventor David Yakos.
And I'm game designer Branson Faustini, and together we get to talk to the people who make the world of fun.
And today's guest, I'm very excited about. She's a brilliant game designer behind Apiary, a competitive worker placement game that takes players on a journey with spacefaring bees from the future. Her latest creation, Wyrmspan, invites players to build a sanctuary for dragons of all shapes and sizes, which was inspired by the mechanisms out of Wingspan. Prior guest, Elizabeth Hargrave, who was on Hidden Roll as well. Wyrmspan brings a fresh perspective to the gaming world.
I think both of them were in the top 20 hottest games on Board Game Geek, maybe even at the same time at one point.
That's hard to do.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
But we're so pleased to welcome Connie Vogelmann to Hidden Roll here today. Connie, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to get to chat about both these games.
Game talk is always fun. So I guess jumping in, how did you get into games? Was it something, were you always playing games as a kid?
Yeah, so yes and no. So my family definitely grew up playing a lot of cribbage and pinochle and kind of board games, some of the kind of simple board games that you might expect. We also had Yahtzee, kind of a Yahtzee variant called Kismet that we played a lot. But I would say in high school and college, I sort of, quote, outgrew board games. And I was like, nah, no one plays board games anymore. No one plays card games anymore. And then when I was in law school, somebody invited me over for dinner and a board game. And I looked at him and I was like, really? Like a board game? And he's like, no, I promise you will like this game. And it was Settlers of Catan. And nice. That kind of, again, like so many folks, that was kind of my gateway game. And I played Settlers, 100 times probably in those early years. And I started a board game group at my law school. And we had Settlers of Catan, we had Puerto Rico, Small World, Ticket to Ride, and I think Power Grid. And I think that was our stable of games that we just played over and over and over again. And then after law school, I moved to Washington, D.C., and didn't really know a lot of folks. And so was sort of actually just joining different meetup groups, trying to basically find different friends, get to know people. And board games were what really stuck, and it's kind of haven't looked back ever since.
So from law to games. So are you also a practicing lawyer, or like how?
Yeah, I am. So I work for the federal government. I do grants law. So basically helping give out federal funding.
Because I hear behind every successful game developer is another paying job. Is that the?
Well, I don't know about that, and I certainly don't know much about like IP or copyright law or anything like that.
So how did you go from being, I guess, these meetups and the game hangouts? That becomes so much of a culture of like the friend hangouts.
Yeah,
kind of defines a lot of the hangouts. How did you go from that then to actually making an impact in the industry?
Yeah, I wish I had a wonderful story here, but I actually kind of fell into it a little bit. So my longtime partner, his name's David, he had an idea for a game. And I offered to help in a very kind of supportive capacity. I was like, hey, I'll work on prototypes. I can, help run playtests, stuff like that. And that effort was very short lived. It turns out that I started trying to take over a little bit, and we don't co design very well. And I think he also realized after a certain point that, he really liked the kind of idea, but he wasn't really big into the iterating and the prototyping and all of the things that kind of go with game design. But I had absolutely caught the design bug at that point. And, a few months after that, I sort of had this idea of what if you have workers that age and die? So instead of kind of developing workers up to a certain point in like a worker placement game and then stopping, what happens if you're kind of continually managing this dynamic pool of workers? At the same time, I was getting into beekeeping, and it just instantly clicked with honeybees. And then I was very, very much off to the races. So Apiary was sort of the first game that I thought about and the first game that I designed.
That's awesome. Could you tell us a bit about Apiary and kind of how it's played?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a worker placement game. It's sort of a mid-weight game. You are taking on the role of a colony of bees in space.
Bees in space.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, full disclosure, when I was designing the game, it was just regular bees. And then when I started working with Stonemeyer, it moved to space. And I was actually pretty happy with the change. It did a lot of kind of mechanical and thematic things that I really liked. But the core concept of the game is that you have these sort of workers, and like a normal worker placement game, you're placing them out onto the board to take actions, and you're getting resources, converting them into different tiles. The tiles go into your hive, and you're sort of building out a hive over the course of the game. But kind of the things that are interesting are twofold. One is that no worker placement spot is ever blocked, so it has this kind of bump mechanism. And then every single time your worker comes back to you for any reason, it ages. And the workers have 4 sides. So they go from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And as they get stronger, or as the number goes up, the action that they can do increases. So it basically gets stronger with each level. Once a bee comes back to you after it is in age 4, it has to hibernate. In the original game, they died, but now we have softened it to hibernation in space, which I think was a change that everyone appreciated, because no one really actually wants to kill their bees.
Don't kill the bees. Save the bees.
But now they hibernate, and then you basically have to get new bees and kind of start them over on their journey from 1 to 4 again. And then the game end is actually controlled by the worker hibernation. So it's a little bit kind of a player controlled end game. So that's sort of how the game plays.
So beekeeping is like a lifestyle. I know a few beekeepers. We've had bees even on our property, and like it becomes all absorbing and fun. Like how much of that actually ended up coming into the game? How much of that inspired not just the title or the theme?
Yeah, so it really inspired the core, absolutely. I mean, because one of the ideas or sort of core ideas with Apiary, in addition to this idea of the workers aging and dying, it's like you're sort of all working toward a common goal. And in some ways that is a little bit of a weird juxtaposition with a lot of worker placement games. Like, who are your workers? What are they doing? I mean, sometimes they're your family members, but sometimes you're just this little emperor and you're sending them out. And I think there's something that's very evocative about being like a queen bee, essentially sending your workers out. In earlier versions of Apiary, they actually had differentiated roles based on their strength, to sort of more closely mimic a hive. So you'd have, a level 1 worker was the one that raised other bees, and you'd have a level 2 worker who'd be, cleaning out the hive, and a level 3 and 4 would be foraging. But what we found is that didn't actually translate to gameplay very well. It ended up being very prescriptive. And so I sort of mucked with that a little bit for purposes of the game. So now 4s are just better everywhere, which makes for much better gameplay. But there's still, I think, a fair bit of that kind of bee concepts and bee themes running through the game. I mean, you can teach dances as part of the game, which are basically your conversions, kind of modeled after the bees' waggle dances. You also have your exploration mechanism.
Let's talk about that waggle dance for a second, because
absolutely.
Not everybody knows about that bees boogie to communicate.
Yeah.
Tell for those that are not deep into bee knowledge, tell us, what is this waggle dance?
Yeah, so waggle dances, bees are fascinating, by the way, but waggle dances are basically how bees communicate the location of food to other bees. So if a bee, goes out and forages, and then she comes back and has found some, really juicy spot, she will basically stand on the entrance to the hive and waggle. And the way, the direction, the pattern, and the vigorousness of the waggle determine the location the source. And scientists have actually looked at this and interpreted them, and then can like actually recreate the pathway, which is really fascinating because it will also include turns and obstacles, and okay, you need to fly over this and under this and around. And I mean, it's really, really fascinating.
The ultimate charades. It's like
right. And I mean, these are creatures that for the most part live a few weeks, and they have developed this kind of form of communication. It's absolutely fascinating. But yeah, so there's these little waggle dances in the game. It's basically you can teach your own conversion to convert resources. And then the other thing I think that's very kind of bee-like. I mean, you're building out a hive, of course, everything is hex shaped, but then you also have your exploration. When you are exploring and gathering resources, you're basically leaving each space better than you found it, which I think is a very kind of in line with the bee theming of the game.
I love how deep bee knowledge is and how you're able to kind of bring that and be inspired by that as well. I'm curious a little bit about worker placement games in general. Like, you throw out that term quite freely, but for those that are maybe just trying to think of like, well, what's a worker placement game? Do you have some other examples that would fall into that category?
Yeah, I mean, so some of the worker placement games that are kind of always held up as classics. I mean, you have something like Lords of Waterdeep, which I think got a lot of people into the hobby. You have something like Viticulture that came a little bit later. Agricola is one of the most common worker placement games that are sort of maybe not most common, but one of the best loved worker placement games. And I do apologize for folks watching on video. My cats are sort of bopping around in the background. But anyway, I mean, I think the definition of a worker placement game, according to Board Game Geek, for instance, it's actually sort of interesting. I think Apiary does not qualify as a worker placement game because I think according to the Board Game Geek definition, it's you send a worker onto an action spot and then that action spot is blocked. And I think one of the reasons that genre has become and that mechanism has become so common is it's very easy to understand, right? Send a worker out onto the board. You do the thing that's printed on the board, and the board can give you some great iconography and great sort of symbols, and this is exactly what it does. The other thing, though, too, is I think it's a very easy way to encourage some kind of player interaction without a lot of very direct confrontation. You're not stealing things from people, you're not targeting specific players, but you are interacting with them because anytime you take a spot, you block another player from taking that spot. And I think it really kind of encourages that interaction. And so I think that's part of the reason why it has become such a popular mechanism.
Would you say Carcassonne fits into that?
That's a good question. I guess it would be called a worker placement game. I don't know. Would you guys classify it as one?
I think it's like a farmer placement game.
Yeah, maybe. It's on the lighter side.
Maybe a little bit.
Going from you're building out the game, you're brainstorming, you're prototyping to Stonemaier. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, again, I kind of fell into it a little bit. So I'm in Washington, D.C., and as soon as I started designing games, I actually ran into a number of other really great designers. So I ran into Elizabeth Hargrave, the designer of Wingspan, at a random playtesting event. And, there's a lot of other great designers in the area. You have Dominic Krampuschetz of North Star. You have Matthew O'Malley, who's designed a bunch of games. And you just have boatloads of really great designers. And so there's a design group in DC that meets fairly frequently. And so I kind of got looped into some of those conversations and those meetings. And then that really kind of helped improve my prototyping game. I was really able to iterate a lot more quickly than I would have been able to do so on my own. Anyway, so I got synced up with this wonderful design group in DC and started really making a lot of progress on my prototypes and my experiences there. And at the same time, I was actually a blind playtester for Stonemaier. At one point, this was after Tapestry came out, I messaged Jamie Stegmaier on Board Game Geek with a whole laundry list of comments because I thought so much of the discourse around Tapestry when it first came out was just really off base. And so I sent him this really big, long message, and he was like, all right, I don't know who you are.
But you just totally lawyered him, huh?
No. It was actually mostly in defense because I think that some of the folks were like, well, I played this game one time and it's really unbalanced. And I'm like, well, you weren't playing very well. I mean, if you win 100 to 80 points in Tapestry, like probably neither of you are playing very well. So anyway, so I got looped into the Stonemaier Blind Playtesting Network, and through that became aware of Stonemaier's Design Day. They do an annual design day every year where they bring together designers. It's basically a playtesting event. And so was looped into that, was planning to attend that, and then reached out to Elizabeth and said sort of, hey, should I pitch this to Stonemaier? Like, what should I do? And she said, yeah, absolutely, go for it. Like, send a message to Jamie. worst he can do is say no. And so I brought Apiary to Stonemeyer's Design Day and then got to talking with Jamie after that. And that was sort of how that connection was made. It's a very circuitous route.
So, but you're batting 1,000 at that point because you pitched your one game to one company and it got picked up. I don't think that's everybody's track record.
No, and I think about that all the time. I mean, just in the sense that I obviously really, really got lucky. I mean, I was very much planning to use Stonemeyer's Design Day as kind of a test. This was going to be one of the first times that I had really play tested it with people that I really didn't know, who wouldn't pull their punches, to sort of see like, all right, do I have something here? Is this a good game? Are people going to like it enough? Should I start pitching to publishers? And then never really got that far. So, I heard somebody say at one point, the harder you work, the luckier you get. And I think maybe there's a certain amount of truth to that. I certainly put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the game. But that certainly doesn't mean that any kind of outcome like this is remotely guaranteed.
First place you pitched it to, did you have a fully fledged prototype? Can you talk about what your prototype materials look like? Like how professional was it?
Not. So I'm a very, very, very big fan of prototyping very quickly, and my prototypes are very ugly. I basically 100% of the prototypes I've ever made have been printed on my home printer. I use a lot of cardstock. I will sleeve things if absolutely necessary. And I use a lot of sticker paper, sticker paper on chipboard or something like that. And I don't do, I've certainly never commissioned an artist. I use a lot of clip art, a lot of sort of stock images and stuff like that. But one of the things that I will say is I think I have gotten a lot better at making prototypes that are very easy to understand. And easy to follow. I'm certainly not a graphic designer, but I think at this point I'm good enough with icons to make things very clear and make very clear player aids. And the other thing I think that actually stands out about some of my prototypes, and this goes back to being a lawyer, is I think I'm actually very good at writing rulebooks and prototype rulebooks. And so I think that for a publisher, I think it's really hard to write a rulebook. It really, really is to make everything clear and to kind of put yourself in the shoes of someone who hasn't ever played your game before. And so I think that's kind of the one area where maybe some of my stuff has stood out a little bit.
That makes complete sense. I can think of a lot of the mass market games where they've got, one rule. It's like all you have to do is like throw it and hit the thing. But when you start to dive into some more of the, competitive, deeper games, every word gets scrutinized, game fights and forums, and you've really got to make sure that that's lawyered out, if you will.
Yeah.
Right.
Writing a good rule book is like an incredible skill. Sometimes it feels like a college thesis or something like that. It's like it's on that level, and it takes so much work to do that.
Especially if you're making the rules and you're like, oh, well, I guess there's an exception there, so I better make a rule for that rule.
Well, I think that actually goes to underlying design philosophy too, that I think especially as I've gotten a little bit more into it, if you find yourself, so two things. One, if I find myself and I have to make more than about one exception, I think the base rule needs to change or the core mechanism needs to change or something needs to change to get that exception out. And the other thing that I found to be really useful is if I can't write a rule for something and I'm just really sitting there and it's been 20 minutes and I cannot come up with a way to say this thing, it probably shouldn't be in the game.
Right.
And so I'll actually kind of use that to retcon some of my design work a little bit too, and just say, okay, if I can't figure out how to explain this in writing, it's too complicated for the game that I'm trying to make.
The one thing I'm appreciating more and more these days are the amount of rules that are now just on videos. So I feel like there's a lot of groups out there that are doing a great job of just taking the rule books and making a how to play. I think we watch more YouTube videos before games than ever actually reading the rule book these days.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that can be a huge barrier too. I mean, we have a few games that have been sitting on our shelves for quite a while, unplayed. And I think a big part of it is because there's no watch it played video or no John Gets Games video. I mean, there's a few different folks who do. I think Maple University does a really good job too. But if one of those groups hasn't done it, I'm like, ooh, maybe we'll do that one next week. And then it just never happens.
Wait for the video to drop. Moving ahead from Apiary, to now, I guess, your next game being Wyrmspan. Can you tell us about how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So at that point, I had been working with Jamie and with Stonemeyer for 4 or 5 months, something like that. Apiary was almost finished. We were kind of doing some finishing touches, some development work on Apiary. And Jamie actually approached me and said, "Hey, I don't even know if this would be possible, but we get requests all the time for for dragons, for a dragon version of Wingspan." And he knew, I think, at that point that I was kind of a science fiction fantasy nerd. And he sort of said, "Look, I don't even know. We'd need to get Elizabeth sign off. I don't even know if this would be possible, but if she was amenable, if she'd be willing to be the developer on this, would you be interested in designing it?" And I said, "Absolutely. I mean, this is like an opportunity of a lifetime." And also too, I mean, I really love Wingspan. I really, really enjoy it. It's so simple and so elegant, but it has such incredible replayability. And I think it has a lot of really deep strategy too that I think people really don't give it credit for. I think people kind of have often bucketed it in this kind of gateway or intro level game, but there are tournaments for
Yeah.
Wingspan all over the place. And so getting to kind of play around with that system as a designer, it's sort of like being a kid in a candy shop.
Well, and dragons. Like,
And dragons, of
it's like
course.
if I was to have a pet bird or a pet dragon, come on here.
I mean, yeah, yeah. And I mean, and I love birds too, but I mean, I grew up, reading, the Anne McCaffrey Pern books and all kinds of, fantasy and stuff like that. And so, God, every kid wants a dragon.
Could you talk a bit about how you changed the Wingspan formula for Wyrmspan?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the final game, there's a few kind of key differences between Wingspan and Wyrmspan. Wyrmspan was always intended to be just kind of a half step heavier or more complicated than Wingspan. The idea was sort of maybe some of the gamers who kind of bounced off of Wingspan because it wasn't quite complex enough. It might appeal to them. Maybe people who didn't like birds, or maybe some of the Wingspan fans who are just kind of looking for the next step. I mean, that game has sold, I think, close to 2 million copies at this point. It's introduced hundreds of thousands of people to the hobby. Like this is kind of the next logical step for a lot of them, to kind of expand their gaming career. So a few of the things that we changed. One is we have this wonderful Dragon Guild, which is basically a track that you bump up and you go around, and it's different each game, so it gives you a little bit of a different replay value, and it gives you, every time you hit 4 or 5 bumps on the track, you get kind of a nice big bonus, and these are kind of competed among the players. So it's a little bit of a race to get the best bonus. Structurally, we have this idea of excavating your caves. So you have to basically, it's a 2-part process in order to play a dragon. You first need to dig out a space for them to live. Then you need to play a dragon on top of them. And basically these cave cards, which are how you dig out your caves, give you kind of an instant infusion of resources. So they're kind of an extra component or an extra resource generating source to manage. We have these little cute hatchlings that are these like little baby dragons that you basically walk over them and you feed them as you go along. And after you've activated them 3 times, they sort of grow up and they give you this kind of extra special reward and bonus. A couple of other things that are smaller. We do have kind of some more fluid action economy in Wyrmspan. So you have a certain number of actions each round, but you can get more. And so players have had a lot of fun kind of playing around with that a little bit. What's the value of an extra action? And then, another thing that I think is really big is that we limited how many times you can activate each of your rows. So in Wingspan, you have kind of 3 main rows that you can activate to get food in the top row, eggs in the middle row, and cards in the bottom row. They're kind of your 3 main resources. And you could activate them as many times as you wanted. So if you want to get food 5 times in a row, you can get food 5 times in a row. In Wyrmspan, we limited it, so the costs every time you activate your row within a round increase, and you're capped at 3 times. And so I think what all of these changes together do is they make it very kind of sequencing dependent. So whether you do A then B then C, or C then A then B, and so on, really makes a big difference in terms of how your round plays out. And so I think it kind of scratches that itch a little bit for folks who want just kind of a little bit of extra complexity. And then the other thing too is just my own design. I absolutely love combos and sort of things pinging off each other. And there's a lot of that kind of worked into Wyrmspan, where you can do one thing that gives you a free action, which gives you a free action, which gives you a bump on something, which lets you do something else. And that's kind of worked into the game as well.
You get those big hero turns that we're all looking for.
So, do you have any advice for anyone who is either just getting their start in the industry, or maybe is a designer working on their first game?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things I think that I've definitely learned that basically don't make my same mistakes. And one of them has to do with what I was talking about before, which is prototyping quickly. I think there's a lot of companies right now that do kind of print on demand prototypes. And I think if you're printing a copy for a publisher or something like that, for submission, that's great because they look wonderful and professional. But if you are in the early stages of game design or game development, I mean, just know that you're going to be doing 20, 30, 40, 50 drafts of your game probably. I mean, it depends obviously on the complexity of the game, but I don't think 30 or 40 versions is completely unreasonable. And so the faster that you can make those versions and the less attached you can be to each version, I think you'll have a lot more success. As soon as you put 20 or 30 bucks into getting a custom printed deck of cards, you're not really going to want to change those cards. But if they're just cardstock that you printed off your printer, it makes it a lot easier. So I think that's a really big part of it. I would also say to find a game design group. And obviously, I'm really lucky being in Washington, D.C., but there's a lot of really great online groups too. I mean, Break My Game hosts several online events every single week. And so just basically getting eyes on your game is key, and not just your friends or your family are the exact same people, because all of a sudden you'll realize somebody will play the game totally differently, and it might have really unintended consequences either for good or for ill. So kind of get as many eyes on your game as you possibly can. And then the other thing that I will say too, and this goes along with sort of prototyping smarter, I did all of Apiary in Microsoft Word. Please don't do what I did. I did it. I got through it, but you're editing every single card individually. So every time you need to change an icon, you are manually moving and placing that icon into that document, and it is incredibly labor intensive. And this goes in the category of prototyping smarter, not harder. I finally switched to Nandeck when I was 80% done with Apiary, and it's a free program. There's some wonderful tutorials online. I have no programming experience at all, but got my way through it. And it basically imports all of your data from Excel. So you type everything basically in Word format, and then you key that onto your cards. And so updating a deck of cards is, you update all of your info in Excel, you click a button and it generates your deck. And putting in the time to do the templates is absolutely, absolutely key on that as well. And then the last thing I'll say too is play games. I know it sounds really, really trite, but sometimes I'll end up in some of these design events, and I'll talk to somebody about the newest game, the newest hotness, and they'll be like, what game is that? I haven't heard of it. I haven't played anything but prototypes for a year. And I would just really encourage that, especially if you want some kind of commercial success, or you want to be pitching to publishers, it's really, really key to know what's hot, because a lot of these publishers are working several years into the future. And so if you come in and say, look, I have been working on this trick-taking game, man, I don't know, trick-taking games are really, really hot right now and have been for a couple of years. So the publishers are probably moving on at this point. So I think kind of being aware of the trends and what's popular is really, really key as well. So those are kind of the few things I would recommend to folks getting started.
Well, there's definitely some good nuggets right there.
Yeah.
I know, like even today, we were playing with one of our prototypes, and we do a lot of high finished out prototypes, and it's like, oh no, we've got to make a couple more changes after we get, and it's like, just get out the Sharpie and those cards get marked up, or stick some more stickers on them, stickers on top of stickers, and
stickers on top of stickers on top of stickers. Yep. Been there, done that.
Before you know it, you've got a good game. This has been fascinating. And I love just your outlook and the creative intensity you have and the details that you look at. You seem like the kind of person that can hold a lot of different pieces at once mentally and be able to compile those in a way that makes it fun for everybody. So congratulations on a couple of really awesome titles that are out there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
But before we wrap up.
Yes, at the end of each episode, we like to ask rapid fire questions here with our hidden roll die.
All right. I'm ready for it.
All right.
Star. All right, Star. If aliens landed tomorrow and wanted a crash course on Earth's board games, which three would you present to them?
Okay, this is a good question. All right, I'm going to start with Cascadia. This is a good intro to the modern gaming hobby. And depending on their grasp of the English language, this one might be a little bit easier for them to start with.
I love that you're taking that into consideration. They're like, nerp, neep, nerp. Oh, no problem. Great.
The next one I'm going to say is Codenames.
Oh, yeah.
Because I would want to introduce them to sort of a variety of games, right? I don't want to kind of pick one genre. And so I would want something in the kind of party game category. Plus, again, if we're working on English language, this is a good vocabulary lesson for them.
You can mix in codename pictures. I hybrided mine with codename pictures and the words together.
Yeah. Oh, that's a tricky one. We've done that one a few times before. And then the last one's the tricky one because this is kind of the heavy Euro game slot. And I think I'm going to go with Feast for Odin. Because it has slightly different, it has a little bit of everything in terms of mechanisms. You know, it has a little bit of worker placement. It has kind of variable player powers. It has like Tetramino tiles. Everyone loves Tetraminos. And I think it really kind of shows how a game can be both broad and deep at the same time. So I'm sure as soon as we get off this call, I'll think of a bunch of better games. But off the top of my head, those are the three that came to mind.
Well, I'm pretty sure with the once the aliens get those games for advice, they're going to go back and start a guild themselves. So. All right, let's roll again.
Well, I was just gonna say that's the real secret to stopping alien domination is just convince them that we have something to offer.
Yes,
True.
All right.
All right. Next question.
Broken Heart. Which game would you send on a one-way trip to the Bermuda Triangle? Ne'er to be seen again.
The thing is, I don't know how many games I actually hate. Okay, here's one. I'm going to go with Spyfall. I'm going to send Spyfall on a one-way trip to the Bermuda Triangle. I love Hidden Roll. I love Hidden Deduction. I hate lying without any basis. And the way that game puts you on the spot makes me so uncomfortable. So that one's going all the way to the Bermuda Triangle, never to be seen again.
That is wonderful. I've got a few friends, and my wife that does that as well, where it's like, she'll get the card, she'll be like, I'm the spy, just move on, let's do another round.
Well, and I'll say this as someone who the Resistance Avalon is perhaps my favorite game of all time, but
Same.
That one gives you, it gives you so much concrete to work with. I mean, because you have so many, votes, and you have data, and you have deduction, and you're trying to find Merlin, and I mean, you have so much to work with. Whereas Spyfall, you're just, I don't know, I'm going to make something up and hope for the best.
That's funny.
Yeah. I think I own like 6 copies of Avalon. Yeah.
It's a brilliant game.
Incredible game. All right. Next question.
The Dagger. All right. In an alternate universe where games determine our country's leaders, which game should they play to decide the fate of the world?
Interesting. So it would have to be something cooperative, I think. I think that would be kind of a key. All right, here's going to be an odd one. I'm going to go with Spirit Island. Because I think it obviously throws a little bit of colonialism on its head. So that's kind of telling you where my politics are coming from. But it's also something that it's relatively complicated. It's relatively complex. And so I think if a world leader is going to be, playing a board game and doing well at a board game, I want to make sure they have
more than just Yahtzee.
Yeah, more than Yahtzee. And I think they also have to have a certain amount of kind of teamwork and ability to work with other players. And so I think something like that to me stands out. That's what I think that the attributes that they should have.
Brilliant. Again, thank you so much, Connie, for being on here today. This has been a pleasure. It's wonderful getting to dive into that genius and see where some of these ideas and the process comes from. Everybody kind of has a little bit different angle, and I feel like you gave us a great window into your world there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've had a great time. Thank you.
You bet. Well, until next time, we'll go play some more games.
This has been Hidden Roll, the brains behind your favorite toys, games, and all things play. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way that you can support us is to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tell your favorite brains to subscribe as well. Hit the bell, thumbs up, leave a comment, and follow Hidden Roll Podcast on Instagram as well. If you know of someone who would be a great fit to be on our podcast, or if you'd like to learn the story behind any toy or game, leave a comment below, or send us a message at hiddenrollpodcast.com/suggestions. That's hidden, ROLE, podcast.com. Once again, special thanks to Pop, People of Play, the one-stop hub for all toy and game inventors. Visit www.peopleofplay.com to learn more. This podcast is also made possible by the continued support of the brains who never grew up, inventors of play, Streamlined Design.